Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Brandenburg, and today I'll be discussing a little bit of the research I've done over the ideas of leadership and gender, specifically as they apply to the world of the culinary arts. This includes things like professional restaurants, franchise restaurants, fast food, high-end dining, and even things like corporate catering and celebrity cooking as well. A little bit of an introduction to this industry before we get into too much of the research here. One thing, we know that the restaurant industry is often portrayed as being high pressure and male dominated. The restaurant industry as a whole is super competitive. People in the industry tend to value prestige over pay, which means that prospective executive chefs and things like that are probably more interested in working for a high-end restaurant than they are for being paid to work for a high-end restaurant. And this industry is perpetuated by very toxic stereotypes. We're going to talk a little bit more about all of these points in more detail as we get to them, but I felt it necessary to kind of lay out a foundation on which we will build with this research. Now, the first thing we'll talk about are some relevant statistics in the industry here, starting with some industry trends. Now, first and foremost, there is still very much a pay gap in the restaurant industry, with the most recent survey being conducted last year finding that women are still paid about 6.6% less than men in the restaurant industry. Now, as we look back at these historical trends here, we can see that the rate is very ambivalent. It kind of fluctuates. It's not certain if there's improvement or, decline happening in the rate of pay here. Now, moving on to the topic of women's representation, about 60% of all women in the U.S. workforce have spent some time in the restaurant industry. This could be anything from wait staff, servers, hostesses, all the way up to executive cooking and head chefs. However, the current workforce in the restaurant industry, as of last year, is about half represented or half made up by women and half made up by men. So there is about equal representation in the overall culinary field between the two genders. Now, women only represent 30% or 36% of kitchen staff. Now, that is a marked kind of promotion above kind of the floor staff that you'd see. Kitchen staff is usually paid higher than servers, higher than hostesses, and that is often where the leadership positions lie. So even though we have 50% representation of women in the industry as a whole, there's only about 36% who are eligible to be promoted up into these leadership roles here. Now, our sources for these or for these data points is Zippia.com, which is a great career statistics website, and then there was an independent study done on globaldata.com, which is where I found the pay information here. Now, when we specifically talk about the statistics of women in culinary leadership, we have this great graphic here on the left side of the screen provided by lunchbox.io, which very clearly illustrates the great discrepancy between male and female leadership in the restaurant industry. Now, before we get into the numbers here, we should break down kind of what these terms are. At the top of the food chain in the culinary industry, you have the corporate executive chefs. These are people who are designing menus, designing dishes for your large chain restaurants. People like, somebody had to come up with the Big Mac recipe, right? That would be a corporate executive chef who comes up with those ideas. Very high pay, very high prestige, and high leadership power. Moving down the list, you have your chef de cuisines, executive chefs, and then you have your head chef, which is kind of regarded as the lowest level leadership position that you can have in the culinary industry. This is someone who still has leadership power, but they're not nearly as high up as the corporate executive chefs. Now, below the head chef position is where we get into things like servers and wait staff, lunchroom supervisors, everything down to lunchroom monitors you can see on the bottom of the graphic here. Now let's look at the numbers, because this is not too easy for me to read personally. So the numbers themselves, which were sourced from, again, Zippia.com, we see that at the very top of the food chain, only 9% of corporate executive chefs are women. Now this is a horrible statistic. When we look at the Forbes top 50, most influential companies per year, even those have higher female representation than the restaurant industry does. I remember from previous units that we looked at in this class, the average was somewhere around 20% female representation at most companies when it comes to the C-suite executives, whereas it's only 9% in the culinary industry. Very dismal. So we can see already that this industry is behind the modern trend, and the modern trend is behind what it should be anyways. As we move down the food chain, we start to see this kind of pyramid form with more and more female representation at lower levels on the on the ladder. We have 13% of executive chefs being female, 20% of head chefs. Again, that's the lowest level of leadership possible, are women. And then as soon as we leave leadership and get into just kind of the floor staff, we see a huge spike to overrepresentation of women in these positions. We have 71% of servers and wait staff being women, and 87% of lunchroom supervisors. This is everything from your school lunch ladies to your cafeteria staff at hospitals being women. So we have very much this kind of pyramid where as we get closer and closer to the top, we see more men and less women. Again, our sources are an independent study done by Wilder, published on lunchbox.io, and then Zippia.com, our career statistics site as well. Let's talk about some of the implications of this data now. First thing we're going to talk about is what we know already, and that is in the current industry, which is already male dominated, what are the trends that we're seeing and what are some of the sources? Now, this first article published by Robinson in 2017, it was a document kind of tracking cases of toxic work environments in the culinary industry. Now, we see this illustrated very much by the likes of Gordon Ramsay, who's very popular and very well known for being brutal and combative and almost abusive to his restaurant staff. Now, that is not just unique to TV. That is very much, according to this article, the standard in the culinary world. Most high-pressure, high-end restaurants have very toxic leadership practices involving yelling, getting up in people's faces, and kind of silencing the little guy, so to speak. Now, the second article, this Johnson and Madera, which my camera unfortunately is covering, but the Johnson-Madera article was an article specifically investigating cases of sexual harassment in the industry. And that was just one example of many toxic and abusive workplace practices, but I found this one very poignant because usually the victims of sexual harassment are female and the perpetuators or the perpetrators are males. So this industry is not only already very toxic and very hostile to its employees, it's known kind of as, this is not a secret. A lot of people know about these toxic environments, which could serve to chase women away from the field and away from trying to climb the ladders in these industries. Now, unfortunately, there's not much research done about the advantage of female head chefs, female executive chefs, female leadership in the kitchen overall, but we can speculate using data that we know about trends that would apply to these situations. Now, this paper here, written by George in 2000, it's a little older, but this is a psychological research paper titled Emotions and Leadership. And this was a research paper that was investigating the effect that emotion and mood has on leadership style and the effect that leadership style has on emotions and mood. So kind of a two-edged sword there. Now, we know from previous units and previous research that we've done that women as a whole tend to prefer more collaborative styles of leadership. What we know now, thanks to the George article here, is that these collaborative styles of leadership often propagate more positive moods, positive emotions, general happiness in the workplaces that they're implemented in. And it kind of makes sense. When you give your followers a voice and when you listen to your followers, they're going to feel more positively about the workplace. Now, something that was very interesting in this Decker article, this was another research article I found. This was titled Male versus Female Chefs. And this was an investigation on the effects of gender differences in the kitchen. And the most interesting thing that I found in this article is that it actually is shown that a kinder, more positive environment equals more creativity from both the leader and the followers. Now, in a very art-led, the industry is called the culinary arts, creativity is valued a lot, and often the most successful businesses are the ones that have the most creative people behind the wheel. Now, this is very interesting because we see not only is the male-dominated and male-overrepresented leadership in the culinary world causing harm to its employees, a shift towards the female representation would benefit both the employees and the businesses. People would be happier, and we could assume that the businesses would be more successful because happy people work better and are more creative. Oh, hang on, let me switch the slide. Okay, so now we can talk about why. Now, why do these why do these stereotypes and biases exist, and maybe where did these things come from as well? Now, this article, or this, it was a paper really written by Kano in 2019, is my favorite source, and I'll talk about this when we review the references at the end, but this is a dissertation written by a culinary arts student titled Masculinity in the Kitchen, and it investigates masculinity in the kitchen, so it's a kind of great source for the project here. And part of this dissertation was a review of these abusive industry trends. We've already covered a couple, but to be more specific, this industry is very much known for its long hours. People are often expected to work early and stay late. There's exploitative pay structures, meaning the restaurant equivalent of an intern is called a charge, and these people are often made to work for free to gain experience in the field as they kind of get their footing. There's a lack of benefits. There's not a lot of profit margin in the restaurant industry for your average restaurant, which means that employers are less likely to offer chefs things like health insurance or retirement options. And then lastly, there's the toxic environments, which we've covered before. Think of your Gordon Ramsay. Think of the short chef from Ratatouille. I can't remember what his name was, but that kind of stereotype of the aggressive head chef has to come from somewhere. Now, on top of all of those kind of overall industry trends, there are these unfair practices and stereotypes and just kind of gendered thinking that also stack onto the issue of female representation in leadership or in a culinary world. Now, again, from this Kano source, we can derive that there is not just a missing lower lung to the ladder, there's actually just an overall broken ladder coming up from lower leadership to higher leadership for females in the culinary industry. There are pressure expectations, and what that means is that employers or upper level leadership in the restaurant industries often expect these kitchens to be very high pressure, very tense environments, very 0 to 100 kind of things. And there is stereotypical gendered thinking that proposes that females are less resilient to that kind of pressure. So already we see that leaders in this industry may feel that the women that they are seeking to employ or looking at employing are just going to be less effective than men. And we know that that's not necessarily the case. Not only are women equally as resilient as men in these scenarios do not have to be so high pressure. There's multiple levels of change that can take place here. Additionally, there's the issue of the time commitment. We've already discussed in the previous slide kind of the unfair expectations for employee time. And something that we see not just in this industry, but in all industries when we discuss hiring female employees, is that there's the belief that they will not be as flexible with their time due to family commitments, the possibility of needing to take maternity leave, and things like that. So very gendered thinking that already kind of brings females down in the competition there. Secondly, there's this idea that I call idolized brutality. I couldn't really find a better title for it. And what that is putting these people, putting your Gordon Ramsays up on a pedestal and kind of making them the role models for culinary leadership, thinking that, you have to be a tough man, you have to be, very aggressive in order to be successful, very sink or swim kind of ideology in the industry here. This is further corroborated by this source I found by Arvella. This was an article titled "The Kitchen Inc. Foodies, Chefs, and Tattoos," and it was a very interesting look at why do so many head chefs have these alternative looks, have tattooed looks. Gordon Ramsay's not the best example, but if you look at a lot of your celebrity chefs, or just industry leaders there, they tend to have very alternative looks and kind of project this idea of strength and toughness and brutality. And that is seen as a reflection of the overall kind of belief that that's what you need in order to be successful in this industry. Obviously, your average person that follows that kind of belief is not going to believe that a female fits that stereotype, or if they do, they have to really be an outlier and really stand out. Thirdly, there is a resistance to change in this industry. Now, this industry is already, perpetuated by bigotry and bigoted thinking. There's a level of feminophobia in there as well. And a great demonstration of this is a survey that was put out last year by the National Restaurant Association, or the NRA. The NRA put out a survey basically asking their member companies if they thought that the diversity and inclusion programs that they were proposing would have a positive effect on their restaurants and on their companies as a whole. And of all of the member restaurants, which is a significant amount of the restaurants in the US, only 30% actually expressed direct support to these programs or stated that they believed that there would be positive change to come about. So if we have people at these top positions in the industry resistant to progressive change as it is, that is only going to add fuel to the fire and further increase the discrepancy between male and female representation in this field. Now, something that I found interesting in the research that doesn't quite fit the overall theme of the presentation here is some theories about the origin of this anti-female industry practices. Where did all these, who was the first guy basically that said that you had to act this way to be successful in the restaurant industry? And the best theory, or the most comprehensive theory I found, was this academic paper published by Cairns and Johnson in 2015. These two are sociological researchers that were working for University of Texas, and they put forth the idea that because the kitchen was historically seen as a stereotypically female place to be, if you think about your 50s atomic family, the woman's place is the kitchen kind of culture, the belief is that when men entered the industry, there was very much a masculine counterculture to kind of prove, for these men to prove to their own egos and to others that I'm not a woman for being in the kitchen. Look at me, I'm just as much of a man. And that might be the origin of all of these toxically masculine behaviors in the workplace, which is very interesting. So we see that there's kind of this false foundation to justify these toxic behaviors as it is. Again, the core theme of all this research that I found is that not only does this problem not have to exist, there are changes on multiple levels that can be occurring all at the same time in order to increase our representation here. Now, lastly, some concluding thoughts just by me. So again, as I mentioned previously before, this industry is already more resistant to progressive change than most other ones are. If we think back to that original statistic of only 9% of executive chefs being women, that statistic looks bad even when you compare it to the rest of the industry, which looks bad when it comes to upper level female representation. Some of the reasons for this, some things that may be chasing away females from this industry, it's just an unattractive job prospect to begin with. You've got this incredibly high pressure environment, this incredibly low pay, these abusive environments. You're expecting your boss to be a Gordon Ramsay and yell at you. As a male, I wouldn't want to work in that environment, much less what I imagine that a female would want to, because the industry is kind of directed or kind of putting females down as it is anyways. So part of this this lack of representation might be stemming from that. People just don't really want to pursue leadership in these industries anyways. Change is occurring, but it's occurring very slowly. And a thought that I had during my research that I couldn't find really any discussion about anyways, is that maybe the existence of the kind of celebrity chefs, like if you think of your top chefs at Food Network, you've got your Rachel Ray's, your Ina Gartens, your Paula Deans, whoever. The existence of these females being put on pedestal on TV might be making it so that the average person who isn't as well educated on these issues doesn't really know or doesn't really think or believe that there is a lack of female representation in culinary leadership. Because to them, they turn on the TV, they see a wealthy female chef, they're like, okay, well, the whole industry must be this way, and they really don't know. I couldn't really find much discussion over that topic, but it's just a thought that I had that I thought was worth putting forwards anyways, maybe worth investigating further. And lastly, it's a little strange thing to include into a presentation, but if for those of you at home that want to continue and do your own research, I definitely recommend this article here. This was that Masculinity in the Kitchen paper, the dissertation published by Kano at University of Texas. Most of the references that I had for this project, I sourced from the reference list of this paper, actually. And then on the second slide here, we have another great source, which was let's see, this one here. This was the psychological research paper. This is very personally interesting to me, but as we investigate these differences in leadership styles in the course, I think that would be a great resource to look into as well. Thank you, and goodbye.